The air carried a soft chill as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the countryside bathed in hues of gray and gold. At the end of a narrow dirt road, an old house stood solemnly, its wooden frame weathered by countless seasons. The wide, empty fields surrounding it seemed to stretch endlessly, shrouded by a light mist that clung to the ground like a hesitant veil. A faint creak echoed from the porch swing, though no breeze stirred the air. The tall windows, cloaked in grime, glimmered faintly as if hiding a gaze behind their dark panes. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, its cry swallowed quickly by the thickening silence. It was the kind of house that felt alive, not in the way of laughter or warmth, but in the subtle way it seemed to hold its breath, listening. From the dirt road it seemed to wait for something, or someone. Michael Gray pulled his truck to a halt at the edge of the driveway, the crunch of gravel under his tires breaking the eerie stillness of the countryside. He'd driven for hours to reach the old family estate, a place he hadn't seen since childhood. The house loomed before him, just as it had in his memories. Tall, solemn, and slightly crooked, as though bowing under the weight of its secrets. Michael sighed, leaning back in his seat for a moment. His reflection in the cracked rearview mirror stared back at him. Weary eyes, unkempt hair, and a week's worth of stubble. Life in the city had taken its toll, late shifts, sleepless nights, and the kind of loneliness that crept in even amidst the noise of urban chaos. This trip was meant to be a reprieve, a chance to breathe, yet, as he sat staring at the house, a quiet unease prickled at the edges of his thoughts. The estate had been left to him by his late uncle, a man he barely remembered but who had been the last to live in the house. The surrounding fields, overgrown and wild, seemed untouched since his uncle's passing. The mailbox leaned at an odd angle, its rusted hinge creaking softly as a gust of wind rattled through the empty landscape. Michael stepped out of the truck, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air smelled of rain and old wood, a faint trace of moss carried on the breeze. He grabbed his duffel bag and made his way to the front steps, each one groaning under his weight. As he unlocked the heavy front door, the house seemed to exhale, its wooden beams creaking softly as though acknowledging his arrival. The interior was exactly as he remembered, dim, dusty, and filled with shadows that seemed to linger just a little too long. Faded wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the air held the faint aroma of mildew and something faintly sweet, like rotting apples. Michael wandered through the rooms, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust coating the floor. The furniture was still in place, shrouded in white sheets that fluttered faintly as he passed. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the house settling. In the kitchen, a calendar hung on the wall, its pages yellowed and curling. The date read April 1968, nearly 5 decades frozen in time. Michael ran his fingers over the counter, leaving trails in the dust, and paused as he noticed something unusual. A single glass sat on the table, untouched, but glinting faintly in the dim light. It was clean, too clean, as though it had been placed there recently. He frowned, brushing off the feeling of unease. Old houses do strange things, he muttered to himself, his voice echoing faintly. As the evening wore on, Michael began to unpack. His room, the one he'd slept in as a boy, felt both familiar and foreign. The bed creaked as he sat down, and the faint sound of rain began to tap against the windows. He glanced at the closet door, slightly ajar, and memories of childhood fears bubbled to the surface. He shook his head, laughing softly at himself. Still, the house seemed to watch him. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the walls felt deliberate, as though the house were alive, studying his every move. Shadows flickered in the corners of his vision, but when he turned, there was nothing there. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling softly around the eaves. Michael lit a single candle, its flickering light casting long, wavering shadows across the room. He stared out the window at the empty fields beyond, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on him. Somewhere deep within the house, a faint noise echoed, a soft thump as though something heavy had shifted. Michael froze, his breath hitching. He waited, listening, but the sound did not repeat. He shook his head and lay back on the bed, telling himself it was just the old house settling. Yet, as he drifted toward sleep, the faint sensation of being watched refused to leave him. Michael woke with a start, unsure of what had pulled him from his restless sleep. The candle he had lit earlier had long since burned out, leaving the room bathed in faint moonlight that seeped through the grime-covered windows. The wind outside had calmed, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. He sat up, rubbing his face, and listened. At first, there was only silence, the kind that felt too perfect, too deliberate. Then, faintly, he heard it. A soft creak, like a footstep on an old floorboard. His pulse quickened. The sound wasn't from his room, but from somewhere deeper within the house. "Old houses," he whispered to himself, though the words felt hollow. He grabbed the flashlight from his bag and flicked it on, the beam of light slicing through the darkness. The closet door across the room was now fully open, though he distinctly remembered closing it before going to bed. Michael's throat tightened, but he pushed the thought aside. Slowly, he stepped out into the hallway. The floor groaned beneath him as he moved, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house seemed alive with faint noises, soft whispers of shifting wood, the occasional groan of the wind, and the distant sound of something brushing against glass. He followed the sounds to the staircase. Peering down, he saw nothing but shadows pooling at the base of the steps. The flashlight's beam trembled as he descended, its light catching on the edges of the furniture draped in sheets. Halfway down, he froze. The faint creak came again, this time louder and more deliberate, like a step taken with purpose. It came from the living room, just out of sight. "Hello," Michael called, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. It echoed faintly, unanswered. He reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the living room. The flashlight's beam swept across the room, revealing the same shrouded furniture and dusty surfaces he had seen earlier. Yet something was different. The glass on the kitchen table was gone. Michael's heart pounded. He moved cautiously, scanning the room. The shadows seemed to shift as he passed, flickering at the edges of his vision. His hand brushed against the wall as he steadied himself, and he felt something cold and damp beneath his fingers. Pulling his hand back, he shone the flashlight on the spot. A dark smear ran down the wall, glistening faintly in the light. It wasn't water, it was thicker, darker. Blood? The sound of shuffling footsteps behind him made him whirl around, the flashlight swinging wildly. There was nothing there, only the empty hallway leading back to the staircase. Michael's breathing quickened. He clenched the flashlight tighter and began to back away, his steps slow and deliberate. As he moved, a low, rhythmic tapping sound began. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing moment. He turned toward the sound, his stomach tightening. It was coming from the far corner of the living room, where a large antique mirror stood covered by a sheet. The tapping was steady, like fingernails lightly rapping against glass. Michael swallowed hard. He stepped closer, the flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the mirror. Reaching out, he grabbed the edge of the sheet and yanked it down in one swift motion. The mirror's surface was clouded with age, its ornate frame cracked in several places. For a moment, Michael saw only his own reflection staring back at him, pale and wide-eyed. Then, just behind him, a shadow moved. A figure standing still in the hallway. He spun around, the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hallway was empty. A chill ran down his spine. Turning back to the mirror, he saw it again. A figure, tall and indistinct, standing motionless. Its shape was blurred, like a smudge on the glass, but its presence was undeniable. Michael stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. The tapping resumed, louder now, as though coming from inside the mirror itself. Grabbing the flashlight, Michael bolted from the living room, his footsteps echoing through the house. He ran upstairs and slammed the bedroom door shut behind him, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The room felt suffocating, the walls pressing in around him. He sat on the bed, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The silence returned, heavy and unbroken. One more time, one more time. Then, just as he began to calm, a new sound reached his ears. It was faint, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. A soft whispering, like voices speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. The sound wasn't coming from outside the door or the hallway. It was coming from the closet. 1 hour later, Tommy's arms felt like lead as he ran through the hall of his house to the dining room, afraid of what he might find. Michael's hand trembled as he pointed the flashlight toward the closet. The door stood slightly ajar, its darkness yawning like an invitation. The whispers grew louder, still unintelligible but now undeniably coming from within. He forced himself to stand, his legs heavy as if weighed down by the unseen presence filling the room. With each step toward the closet, the whispers became sharper, layered with faint sobs and murmured words. The air grew colder, the kind of chill that sank into the bones and made his breath cloud in the dim beam of light. When he reached the door, he hesitated, gripping the edge with a hand slick with sweat. "There's nothing there," he whispered to himself, though the words felt more like a plea than reassurance. Taking a deep breath, Michael yanked the door fully open, the hinges screeching in protest. The flashlight illuminated the inside of the closet, a cluttered space filled with dusty coats and forgotten boxes. For a brief moment it seemed empty, just a relic of the house's long abandonment. But then the light caught something. A shape tucked deep in the shadows, hunched and motionless. Michael's breath hitched. The figure wasn't solid. It shimmered faintly, like smoke caught in a beam of light. Its face was obscured, but its head tilted slightly as if acknowledging his presence. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond, but the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against his ears. Then, without warning, it moved, its head snapping up, revealing hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Michael stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in his grip. The figure stepped forward, its movements unnaturally fluid, as though gliding rather than walking. Its presence filled the room, oppressive and overwhelming, as if the very air had thickened. "Huh?" As it drew closer, Michael's instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet remained rooted to the floor. The figure raised an arm, its hand outstretched, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost crept along the walls and floor, crackling softly as it spread. A single word broke the silence, spoken in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar. "Leave!" The word echoed through the room, rattling the walls and making Michael's knees buckle. He fell to the floor, clutching his head as the sound reverberated in his skull. Closing his eyes, he felt the sound wheeling around him, constantly returning to fill his ears. The figure loomed over him, its hollow eyes fixed on his, and for a moment, Michael felt as though he were being pulled into the void, into a place of cold, endless silence. Summoning every ounce of strength, he scrambled backward, his hand brushing against the flashlight. He grabbed it and swung the beam wildly toward the figure. The light struck it, and for the briefest moment it faltered, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. Seizing the opportunity, Michael bolted from the room, his footsteps pounding against the wooden floors. The house seemed to come alive around him, doors slamming shut, the walls groaning as if in protest. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, chasing him as he ran down the staircase. He reached the front door and yanked it open, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. Without looking back, he sprinted toward his truck, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Caused the truck. When he reached the vehicle, he flung the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat. His hands shook as he jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life, and he sped down the driveway, gravel flying as the house disappeared in his rearview mirror. For a moment, he thought he was safe, but as he glanced at the mirror, his blood turned to ice. In the back seat, reflected faintly in the glass, a pair of hollow eyes stared back at him. Michael drove through the night, the headlights cutting through the darkness, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The house, its whispers, and the chilling presence of the figure still haunted him, lingering in his mind like an unwanted shadow. But as the miles stretched between him and the estate, something strange began to settle within him. A quiet calm, like the hush after a storm. The tension in his chest loosened, though his body still felt wired, alive with the memory of the terror he had experienced. The further he drove, the more the world outside the truck seemed to return to normal. The trees swaying gently in the breeze, the soft glow of distant streetlights flickering on. He passed familiar landmarks, his eyes scanning for something that felt like home. He almost let out a sigh of relief. But even as he drove, the nagging sense that he was not alone lingered. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see those hollow eyes staring back at him. But the seat was empty. The roads were empty. It was just him, alone in the night. Yet despite the calm, the house never truly left his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for him, not just to return, but to witness something. As if it had been patient, observing, and now it had marked him in a way he couldn't understand. Somewhere along the highway, a soft sound tugged at his attention, a faint tapping, almost like the sound of fingernails against glass. He frozen, his pulse quickening. He glanced around, but the truck was empty. He shook his head, half laughing at himself, trying to calm his racing thoughts. To his credit, it was nothing. It had to be nothing. The sound faded as quickly as it had appeared, and Michael let out a breath, though it didn't feel like a true release. The tapping, the whispers, the presence. It was all so close, yet so distant. By the time he reached the edge of a small town, the early light of dawn began to break, painting the sky with soft pink hues. He pulled over to the side of the road, his truck's engine rumbling softly as he came to a stop. He sat in silence for a long time, watching the sky change, feeling the cold air slip through the cracked window. The house, the figure, it was all so far away now, yet its shadow loomed within him, a part of his soul that couldn't be shaken. Perhaps it was a warning, or maybe it was something more, something that could never be fully understood, no matter how far he ran. But as the sun finally rose over the horizon, casting a warm glow across the land, Michael felt the tension loosen, just a little. He wasn't sure what had truly happened at the house, or why the figure had haunted him. But one thing was certain: the house would always be there, waiting, watching in silence. Strangely, he sometimes felt, as Michael drove into the morning light, the faint sound of tapping echoed in his ears, growing softer, as if a shadow was calling him back. Always waiting, the wind howled softly through the trees, its mournful cry blending with the distant sound of raindrops tapping against the roof of the cabin. Nestled deep within the woods, the small, weathered house stood quiet and still, surrounded by thick fog that wrapped the landscape in a thick, ghostly blanket. Inside, the fire crackled lazily in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Anna sat by the window, watching as the mist seemed to swirl and shift outside, though no breeze stirred the air. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky, bare and skeletal in the autumn chill. There was something unsettling about the silence here, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand at attention, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed through the room, startling Anna. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a soft scraping sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Her breath caught in her throat, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. Who could be out there, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? She rose slowly from her chair, her pulse quickening as she approached the door. The knock came once more, urgent, frantic, before the sound of something or someone scraping along the wooden floor reached her ears. Anna hesitated in front of the door, her hand hovering just inches from the cold, weathered wood. The air inside the cabin had grown still, too still, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The soft flicker of the fire was the only sound, but it felt distant now, swallowed up by the odd sensation that something was very wrong. She glanced at the windows once more, but the fog had thickened, and she could barely make out the dark shapes of the trees beyond. The trees. Her mind flicked back to earlier that evening when she had arrived. The dense forest had felt strangely silent, as if it was holding something back. The usual rustle of leaves and chirp of evening insects was absent, leaving only the unnerving, heavy quiet. But she had dismissed the thought. This cabin was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, an escape from the constant rush of city life. Anna had been looking forward to some solitude, a few days away from her bustling work life. The online research had shown the cabin to be charming, set in an isolated area perfect for hiking and unwinding. The photos had painted it as a perfect retreat, though they hadn't mentioned the odd history that came with it. An old property, inherited and used by few over the years. Thousands of people had once come here for health, and now its stories, though vague, whispered of strange occurrences, unsettling noises, doors that opened on their own, whispers in the wind. But those were just stories, nothing she hadn't heard before. The knock came again, loud and sharp, breaking her thoughts. She could feel the weight of it now, an invisible pressure that seemed to push at the walls of the cabin. The air felt heavier and colder, and her breath caught in her throat. Anna slowly turned the doorknob, her fingers trembling despite herself. She took one cautious step back, just enough to open the door a crack, and peered out into the fog. Nothing. The space outside was empty, just as she had expected. The rain had started to fall in soft sheets, creating a soft hiss as it met the earth. The ground was damp and dark, the trees barely visible in the shifting fog. The knock had stopped, but the strange sensation of being watched hadn't. Just as she began to close the door, she noticed something on the ground, a faint, wet trail leading away from her doorstep. It was odd, too precise to be the result of the rain, as though something or someone had just been there. Anna felt the hairs on her neck rise. She stepped out onto the porch, cautiously scanning the area. There was nothing in sight, only the fog, thick as ever, swirling in the distance. Her boots sank into the damp earth as she moved forward, following the trail. As she walked, the fog thickened, blurring her vision. Each step felt heavier, the atmosphere colder, pressing in around her. She reached the edge of the porch, and then, there, beneath the tree at the far end of the yard, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Figure, standing still, watching her. The figure was barely visible through the mist, but it was unmistakably there. Tall, draped in a long, flowing cloak, its face obscured in shadow. Anna froze, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't make out any details, but the feeling of being watched was palpable, suffocating. "Hello?" Her voice was shaky, barely audible against the sound of the rain. The figure didn't move. Her mind raced, and in the pit of her stomach, a deep unease began to twist. She considered running inside, slamming the door shut, and pretending it was all just a trick of the fog. But something stopped her. Something told her she had to know. Nowhere did she find the lamp at which she instantly recognized as Cassie's. She stepped forward again, her boots silent against the soaked ground, the figure still unmoving, its form a dark silhouette against the white mist. The space between them seemed to stretch longer with each step, but Anna pressed on, drawn toward the stranger like a moth to a flame. But the closer she got, the more she realized something wasn't right. The figure, though standing still, wasn't quite still. There was a faint movement, a swaying as if caught in the wind, though the trees around her remained eerily silent. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took another step. The figure's head tilted slightly, but it still made no move, no sound. She felt her feet faltering, the earth beneath her suddenly slick, as if the ground was pulling her closer. "Who are you?" Her voice cracked. She almost didn't want to hear the answer. Then, without warning, the figure lifted its head, and Anna saw the eyes, dark, hollow, and empty, like the abyss itself. A shock of ice raced through her veins. The figure's face was no longer obscured. It was a face she recognized, one she had never seen, but one that was familiar all the same. Her grandmother, the face that had been buried in her childhood memories, the face that had always smiled gently at her, the face of the woman who had raised her, the woman who had told her stories of the forest at night. But this face, this was different. The smile was gone, replaced with something far colder. The eyes were vacant, as if the life had been drained from them. Anna stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure didn't move, but its presence, its gaze, seemed to follow her. Anna's breath quickened as she stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure didn't advance, but the oppressive weight of its presence seemed to press in on her, suffocating the air around her. The fog grew thicker, swirling around her feet like a living thing, and the rain had intensified, now coming down in steady sheets. It was as if the world had narrowed, leaving her with nothing but the haunting silhouette in front of her. "Grandma?" Anna's voice trembled, as though saying the name aloud might shatter the fragile calm. But the figure didn't respond, didn't even move. It just stood there, watching her with those empty eyes that sent an icy chill down her spine. Her grandmother had passed away years ago. Anna had been a child, and she remembered the stories her grandmother would tell of the woods, stories that always felt more like warnings than bedtime tales. She could still hear her grandmother's voice, soft but urgent, cautioning her about the forest's strange powers, the trees, the fog. "Is this some kind of joke?" Anna asked aloud, her voice shaking, but her words felt hollow, swallowed by the thick fog. "Who's there?" The figure didn't answer. A strange rustling sound broke the silence, coming from behind her. Anna spun around, her heart skipping a beat. The trees, which had been perfectly still moments ago, now seemed to shift ever so slightly, the branches creaking as if moving of their own accord. The wind had stopped entirely, and there was an unnatural stillness in the air, broken only by the faint sound of something scraping, like nails across stone. Anna's eyes darted to the cabin, but the door was still open. the dark interior a void that seemed to beckon her. Something in her stomach twisted, urging her to go back inside, to lock the door and hide. But the figure in front of her held her rooted to the spot. It felt as though the world was shifting, the boundaries between reality and something darker becoming ever more fragile. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Anna saw something moving in the fog, a shadow darting between the trees. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched it move closer, its form indistinct, like smoke billowing through the air. It moved fast, faster than she could have imagined, and before she could even react, it was gone, vanished into the mist. She didn't know if it was real or if her mind was playing tricks on her, but the sense of unease deepened. The whispers returned, faint at first, like a breeze that barely stirred the air. Anna strained to listen, but they were too distant to make out any words. It was like hearing a conversation from the other side of a door, too muffled to understand, but close enough to make her skin crawl. A cold shiver ran down Anna's spine, and she turned back toward the figure. The eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were now fixed on her with a deeper intensity. The figure was no longer just an observer. It was a presence, a force that seemed to reach into her very soul. "Grandma!" Her voice broke this time, the word coming out more as a whisper of desperation than a question. But there was no response. Alice glanced at the clock. Instead, the figure slowly lifted one arm, its long fingers stretching out toward her. Anna froze, unable to move, as the fingers reached through the fog, closer, closer until the coldness of the air around her seemed to press against her chest. She could feel the space between them closing, the thick, suffocating atmosphere of the forest pulling her in. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight whatever this was, but her body wouldn't obey. The fog was too thick, too oppressive, and as the figure's hand reached closer still, Anna felt something deep within her, the feeling of being dragged under, of losing herself to something far darker than the forest. The whispers grew louder now, their words clearer, though still indistinct. They were no longer coming from the trees, they were coming from within the figure, from the depths of its empty eyes. Without warning, the figure moved, a swift motion that sent a wave of cold air crashing against Anna's skin. Its hand clasped around her wrist, a grip like ice, and she gasped, the air being sucked from her lungs. "Leave." The word was whispered, but the force behind it was undeniable. It wasn't just a voice, it was a command. Anna's mind reeled, her body fighting against the grip, but it was as though her limbs no longer belonged to her. The figure's hold tightened, dragging her closer, and the fog seemed to close in around them, thickening like a barrier. "Please," Anna gasped, though she didn't know if she was begging for the figure to stop or for something else. "Please, I don't understand. Why are you here?" The figure didn't answer, but the whispers grew louder still, their frantic urgency echoing in her ears. The world around her seemed to narrow, nothing but fog, nothing but the chilling presence of the figure. Her mind spun with fear, but also with an overwhelming sense of being drawn into something much older, something far more powerful than she could comprehend. Then, in a single sudden motion, the figure released her. Anna stumbled back, her heart racing, but before she could catch her breath, a cold, sharp wind whipped through the trees, sending a cascade of leaves spiraling around her. The figure stepped back, its form flickering, as though it were dissolving into the fog. Here, in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. Anna stood alone in the empty yard, the fog swirling around her feet, the weight of its presence still lingering in the air. Her mind raced, her body trembling, but she couldn't move. The silence was deafening. Then, the ground beneath her feet shifted, just slightly, but enough to make her heart skip. The trail that had been left behind was now gone, erased, as if it had never existed. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a quiet calm. But something was different now. Something was waiting. Anna stood there, trembling, her mind reeling with the events that had just unfolded. The figure had vanished, but its presence, its cold grip, lingered, seeping into the very marrow of her bones. She could feel the weight of the air, still heavy and unnaturally thick. The fog that surrounded her seemed more oppressive than ever, the trees looming like silent watchers, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. She took a tentative step back toward the cabin, but her body felt unsteady, as though the earth beneath her was shifting with every movement. The stillness of the forest was now a tangible thing, pressing against her chest with each breath. Her footsteps were soft on the wet ground, barely audible, but the sound of something else, something far more subtle. "I," echoed in her mind. She had been picturing her friends' bodies getting softer and softer every time They weren't distant anymore, they were right beside her, soft like the rustling of dry leaves in the breeze, only they weren't carried by the wind. They were inside her head, growing louder with each passing second. "Leave, before it's too late." Anna's breath caught in her throat. She whipped around, but there was no one there. No figure, no shadow in the mist. The trees were silent, their branches unmoving. Yet the whispers continued, closer now, urgent. "Thackeray head, Anna, you should have listened." The voice was familiar, yet not. It was her grandmother's voice, faint, ethereal, distorted with time and distance. But it didn't carry the warmth she remembered. It was cold, sharp, with an edge of something ancient, something vengeful. A shiver ran down her spine, and she took another step back toward the cabin, her hand outstretched toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, it fell from her grasp. The door was now ajar, and beyond it, the house was dark. Too dark, as if the light from the fire had been extinguished entirely. The interior was empty, hollow, as though it had never been inhabited. There was a suffocating emptiness to it now. For a moment, she stood frozen in place, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. And then, from deep within the shadows of the house, a faint noise caught her attention. A soft, scraping sound, like nails on wood. She couldn't breathe. The whispers, now deafening, filled her mind, and for a brief moment Anna thought she saw something move in the darkness. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable. Her grandmother, no, not her grandmother. A figure, cloaked in shadow, emerged slowly from the darkened hallway. The face that appeared was hers, but it wasn't. It was distorted, warped, a grotesque mockery of the woman who had raised her. The eyes were hollow, dark and endless, and the smile that stretched across the figure's face was thin and jagged, a smile that spoke of ancient grief and betrayal. Anna's heart pounded in her chest, her legs shaking beneath her. The air had grown colder, the temperature dropping with each passing moment, until it felt like she was standing in the depths of winter. She tried to move, to run, but her feet were stuck to the floor, as though the very ground had claimed her. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, and with each step the darkness within the cabin seemed to grow, swallowing the light that had once filled the room. The scraping sound continued, louder now, as if something was being dragged toward her. Something old, something dead. "Leave now," the figure whispered, its voice a rasping echo of the past. "Before it claims you too." The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping Anna inside the cabin with the creature. The temperature dropped even further, the chill seeping into her bones, freezing her in place. The whispers grew into a cacophony, swirling around her, crashing against her mind. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the figure advanced. There was no escape. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. Dire and terrific, she sank to the ground. Suddenly, the scraping noise ceased, and all that was left was the sound of her own heartbeat, thumping in her chest like a drum. Then came the voice, once more. But this time it was different, clearer, more commanding. "You've come too far, Anna. You should have listened. Now you are one of us." Frank turned to me, slowly shaking his head, as if he were too tired to speak. Anna's eyes widened in horror as she felt something shift in the air, something ancient and dark. The floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble, the walls closing in, as though the very house was alive, feeding on the fear in her heart. The figure raised its hand, and Anna felt her body respond involuntarily, her arms lifted, her legs unsteady, as if being controlled by something unseen. Her chest constricted as though she were suffocating. The whispers grew into a roar, deafening her, until all that remained was the cold emptiness of the cabin. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the figure stopped. The air stilled. The darkness receded. Anna found herself standing in the middle of the room, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The cabin was silent, almost unnaturally so, as though nothing had happened at all. The figure, the whispers, the cold, everything had vanished in the blink of an eye. For a moment, Anna stood there, confused, disoriented. But then she noticed it, the one thing that hadn't disappeared. "Crying," she said. The mirror. It hung in the corner of the room, slightly tilted, as though it had been disturbed. Anna stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest as she gazed into the reflective surface. What she saw made her blood run cold. Her fingers trembled. The figure that had stood before her was now reflected in the mirror, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. But there was something else in the reflection. A second figure, standing beside her. A voice asked what she thought of the second figure, and she softly replied, her own reflection smiling back at her, though the smile was not her own. It was cold, it was empty, it was raw. Anna stumbled back from the mirror, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs as her mind struggled to make sense of what she had just seen. The reflection, her reflection, smiled back at her, cold and empty, the hollow eyes staring directly into her soul. The chilling presence in the room seemed to weigh down on her, making each breath feel heavier, more labored. She turned away from the mirror, her feet unsteady, and back toward the door. The house felt colder now, the air thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The whispers had faded, but their absence left an eerie silence in their place, one that gnawed at her nerves. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in, the dim light casting long shadows that danced with unsettling movement. But the door was still locked. Anna grasped the handle, her hand trembling, and tried once more, but the door remained unyielding. Panic surged through her, and she twisted the knob again and again, each failed attempt fraying the edges of her sanity. The house was trapping her, keeping her inside, just as it had done with her grandmother so many years ago. She paused, her mind racing. The words her grandmother had once whispered to her echoed in her ears, soft and urgent. "Some things never leave this place, Anna. You must never return." The weight of those words pressed down on her now, and for the first time, Anna understood their true meaning. This cabin, this forest, was a place of something far darker than she had ever imagined. Something ancient, something that took and never let go. Anna's fingers brushed against the old wooden walls, the texture rough under her fingertips. The room felt alive, as though the very structure of the house was pulsing with a life of its own. A strange, familiar warmth crept over her skin, the same warmth she had felt as a child, wrapped in her grandmother's arms. But now it was twisted, as though the warmth was trying to draw her closer to the heart of the house, to something deep inside it that was waiting for her. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, trying to push away the growing sense of doom. But when she opened them again, the figure from the mirror was standing before her, no longer a reflection, but a reality. Its hollow eyes met hers once more, its smile growing wider, more twisted. "Oh!" Anna swallowed hard, her mind screaming to run, to escape. But her legs felt heavy, her body refusing to move. The figure's presence was overwhelming, suffocating. "You're one of us now," it whispered again, its voice cold, like the wind outside. "You cannot leave. You never could." And with that, Anna felt the air shift again, heavier, darker. A deep, throbbing silence spread throughout the house, suffusing the very air around her. The darkness wrapped around her like a shroud, and as she stood there unable to move, she understood. The house wasn't just a building, it was a prison, a tomb for the lost, a place that claimed those who entered and held them forever. The whispers returned, this time louder, more urgent, but there was no escape. The walls closed in, and Anna felt her body freeze, her soul drawn into the house, to join the others who had never left. The figure's smile stretched even wider, and in that moment Anna knew there was no escape. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed her grandmother, and the forest, with its fog and whispers, would never let her go.